Yes, I'm Erica. I'm a Senior Threatened Species Officer and I work for the Department of Biodiversity and Conservation, though we're changing names and becoming a new department on the 1st of January, I believe, as we split from planning. I don't know, at our level we just have to get on and do the job rather than all the upper level stuff. So I work in one of the regional deliveries units across the state. So we have kind of 6 regional deliveries as well as our national parks partners. So I'm in the Greater Sydney team, so we mostly work across that greater, the Sydney Basin and up into the Blue Mountains. But I get the really urban areas because I work along the coastal areas, mostly in northern Sydney and mostly the eastern suburbs. So I just wanted to give a few examples. Well, first to give an acknowledgement of the Aboriginal partners that we work with, and we try to incorporate them into our work as much as we can and that connection back to their country. So I wanted to just give a couple of case studies on species that I've been working on. Alocasuarina portuensis is probably one of the longest standing translocation programs that have been going on in New South Wales. It was discovered by the ranger back in 1986 after an arson attack went through Neilson Park, which is in Vaucluse, so very, very urbanised and in the rich part of Sydney, a very small reserve, highly used. But an arson attack went through that because fire had been excluded through that reserve. No one could remember a fire going through since white colonisation. But the ranger, being very observant, noticed it was a little bit different and finally it was described as a new species. But unfortunately we only had 10 plants left in that area. So quickly an ex situ collection was undertaken by our wonderful botanic gardens and the Australian Botanic Gardens, really great resource that we have there. That was mostly from clones from the seed collected. Unfortunately, the original plants started to die and that plant effectively became extinct in the wild back in 2003. Oh, going the wrong way. So in the early days, a recovery team was formed. It got listed. A recovery plan was written at a Commonwealth level. Bush regeneration began, so having that threatened species there was a real emphasis for the local community, and they continue to meet, minus the COVID days, every Tuesday. So that's been 20, 30 years. They turn up, really fabulous group, and they just keep going with that work because we've got a really high weed load. And back in the 1990s, we began a planting program for that species at Neilson Park. So that was really led by the National Parks and Wildlife Service who manage that area. There's a big office at that site as well as a work depot. So we had an uninterested senior field officer who's led that program for 20 years. He tried to retire, but we don't let him. He comes back as our contractor and lots of volunteering work on top of what we actually pay him for. And then in the 2000s, we started to move the things into other parts of Sydney Harbour National Park, so around the Gap, with our council areas as well. And we started up that biennial monitoring. So we've done numerous plantings over the years. It's quite easy to grow, it produces seed. But unfortunately, in that 20 to 30 years, we've had no natural recruitment. So effectively, not a great outcome for a translocation program. So interest began to wane. The volunteers stayed on as they do. The field officer stayed on as he did, but kind of the threatened species staff kind of moved on to other new projects. But then we had the Saving Our Species program come through with revitalised funding in New South Wales, and we re-kick-started the program in 2016. We prepared a new translocation plan. We ordered new plants from our ex situ collection out at the Botanic Gardens. And we decided to try a few new different things as part of our work. So we a lot of the areas that we'd looked at before, it was the only spot that was found was at that Nielsen Park, but we did have other areas that we looked for and not been able to find. So we wanted to see if we could try and translocate it to some of those other similar habitats in the islands and across the other side of the harbour into Sydney Harbour National Park, which goes across both sides. So then came some of the issues. So I had this idea that we'd plant onto some of those islands that kind of were very close to Nielsen Park. So I had a lovely day on the National Parks boat going out looking at all the islands. It was one of the few times my manager wanted to engage with the project when we were getting on the boat. I said she wasn't allowed to, the boat was full. And so we went and had a look at some of those islands, and then you start to get the issues of those islands are really heavily used as part of the other role that national parks have, which is recreation. They are hired out to corporate events, they're hired out to do the fireworks, and so you can't start to block views, and there's all these other considerations. And then the few areas that we might have been able to go into has significance on Aboriginal middens. So there was a lot of logistics in just finding these areas in urban areas. It's a lot of competing interests, so that was one of the issues we faced. And then we had the logistics of when we're actually doing the plantings. We grew the plants, they were ready to go in the ground. Then Paul Ibbotson, who's our expert on the species, had been doing the plantings for all the previous years, got called up to do jury duty, happened to be a murder trial. He was off for 6 months. And then as the plants were getting delivered and we were getting ready to put them on the ground, my son got appendicitis. He was sent home from hospital the first time, so it ended up being quite serious. So I was out of the game, and that led to a lot of problems with the actual planting. So even though we'd done a translocation plan, I thought we were being clever by going, here's big areas that we might be able to plant into, because that would give us options in the future that we could go back and we'll put a bit here and we'll put a bit there. So when on the day they went to do the plantings, they didn't really have as much guidance as they needed to. So we ended up with plants on steep weedy slopes, we ended up with plants too close together. But even more difficulty was, even though they recorded both the data, both at the original sites and on some of our new areas, none of that data ended up coming to me. So then we had lost plants in the field. We're heading into a really hot summer. We end up having plants die because I didn't know they were there. So even though we're having people going out and watering, where they were clustered we found them, but other ones we just never found, because the people who did the plantings were the National Parks and Wildlife Service rangers. They were all called off onto fire duty, so not a lot of them were around to do that handover. So even with all the really good planning, you can have logistical delays. And I think a lot of our team are starting to do to that live feeding tablets, where you get that live feed rather than having to download GPS, and things that we can do to address some of these issues in the future. So because we're heading into that really drought period, it's normally you can kind of put this plant in, it does all right, doesn't need a lot of maintenance, maybe a couple of waters, but we really headed into that drought period and it required a lot more maintenance, and not having those national park staff around to help with us meant that we had to bring in extra resources to either pay for it, or I was driving across the harbour with my kids to do watering over the Christmas holidays, which they enjoyed. So the other thing that we tried to do with the new translocation plan was to look at this kind of lack of fire. If that was one of the driver, it holds its seed in the canopy, and could we reintroduce that fire back into the system that had been missing? So a couple of reasons. We have a lot of mesic species coming into Sydney Harbour, so that real movement of rainforest species, pitostrums, the cheese trees. And we also wanted to have that ash bed, so we've been collecting seed, it produces seed quite easily, and we wanted to have that ash bed that we could try and be that middle person to go and reintroduce it. It takes a year to get years and years sometimes to get those fires in the right conditions. So in the interim, we've been controlling mesics as a measure. But unfortunately, we also ran into problems with that. We'd been doing it for a long time. It's a fairly standard bush regeneration practice in the Sydney region. but then we had staff came in that said that removing any native plant is not allowed on national parks. So we kind of had a year or two where we weren't able to do that action. We had to go back and do guidelines, do a review of environmental factors and get that signed off by the area manager. So it all just kind of timing and processes. So we included the seed scattering as part of the new translocation plan. We had our seed. We didn't leave it at the National Parks Office because all the stuff collected before had gone missing, so it sat at my house. So again, it's having that, where does this stuff sit, and that logistics of who holds that seed, where is it, what if that person's not there when you actually need it, and who knows where it is a big issue as well if it's not sitting with your gardens. So in order to move the burning up, as part of the Saving Our Species project, we funded all that fire preparation work to be done because the ranger was incredibly busy. They had a major seawall collapse at Nielsen Park and he was kind of offline doing that. So we provided funding because we really wanted to move it up to pay for all of that work. So finally, we had our first burn in 2021. Exciting. Except for they put it on a day that it rained, the fire went out. It co-occurs with another of my species, an Acacia terminalis, a subspecies of that, and the areas that burnt were really good habitat for that, so we decided in the end not to put out our seed because we didn't want to interfere with that species. We then had a burn at Middlehead, which is one of our translocation sites, so we thought, great, end of COVID, we could kind of get out there and scatter the seed. It was an opportunity. We had an Aboriginal intern. It was a way for her to come out into the field because she'd been stuck doing everything online and hadn't actually met anyone. So we scattered seed, but unfortunately unsuccessful because it had a really high weed load and the weeds just came through. Finally, this year we got our next burn. And it's all those logistics. Even though we'd had years in the planning, we'd had a lot of staff changes. They forgot to tell us there was going to be a burn, even though we'd been the ones prepping for it. Luckily, we found out. So we were able to go out there a week after the burn and then 2 weeks later and put out our seed. Unfortunately, we got no recruitment because it was in quite a dry period. So it's kind of back to the drawing board, and now we've used our seed. So it's again about having enough seed to be able to keep going with these things. Other issues we had one of our whole translocation areas mowed by the contractors in the national park, not once, but twice. And partly it's like we have the issue often in these urban areas, do we put signage up? Do we not put signage up? In that case, we decided not to. They've gone back and re-signed some of it now. And one of the reasons we don't is we get a lot of collection. And after we did put signage, we have members of the public coming up to the ranger going, we've collected the seed off the endangered plant, but we're having real problems growing it. Can you give us guidance on how to do it? And you've got to explain to them, well, you're actually breaking the law. But you know, yeah. And we have people wanting to grow it, and I think the Wallamai pine has a lot to do with that. People want to grow these things in their garden because that's what they've done. A lot of them have these other species, and trying to explain to them. But even when we do have signage, and that's one of the little green posts that national parks use about slashing, we still have damage to the plant, and that was often because there was a lot of weeds. So I took the picture kind of after I'd gone in and hand weeded it myself. So yeah, still having damage, and we have a lot of debate about whether to put signs up at sites or not. So for this project, Sam's kindly doing a new genetic project to see what we can get out of the material we have. And also we've got a living collection and a seed collection, and to see where they sit. All of the past collections have kind of been done through cuttings of the living collection, but that's quite expensive. It has a 10% strike rate. So this time I decided to get a lot more material from the seed collection. And although that might have impacts for breeding and genetics and things, I wanted to try and do some of the other thing by having more material. Could we put it out at more sites to see how it went? It would be able to have a bit of a living collection by being able to produce more material, so we'd have things to do experiments like with fire. So another things we've had, I guess, in New South Wales is we work under the Biodiversity and Conservation Act, where the threatened species work, but under the National Parks and Wildlife Service, they've now got a policy of zero extinction on park, even though this one's already extinct in the wild. It's been declared one of these assets of intergenerational significance, and that brings a whole other arm of funding and resourcing, and national parks are getting more threatened species officers, so building a bigger team to work on these species as well. We've now got fire into our toolbox, so part of the limitation in the past was people who live in these $10 million houses surrounding this didn't necessarily want fire and the smoke, but I think having the big fires come through has really changed people's perception of use of fire and the importance of hazard reduction. And the volunteers, they just keep going. They just, yeah. Sean did a Plant Heroes video on it, so if you want to learn more about that project. So I don't know how I'm going for time. The other species I wanted to touch on was Grevillea kalei, critically endangered, only from an 8-kilometre radius. A couple of people in this room have worked on the species, really highly fragmented. 21 patches on mixed tenure, so we've got a little bit on National Park, we've got Private Land Council, road reserves, Ausgrid, Transgrid. It's pretty well researched, including Tanya up the back, who did it before she headed west. She did the genetics on the project when she was at the Uni of Wollongong. So it's got a really long history of management. But I kind of wanted to touch on this species because we did some work with the University of Queensland where we had to do some develop process models as a bit of a case study on species, and then look at funding scenarios was the other part of that project. If we did no management, if we managed it for 5 years and then stopped funding, and then if we did ongoing funding, what the kind of outcomes for different aspects and threats would be. But this was part of the process model that we developed as that project. And it's been 5 years since we did that work. So we always knew that it was really important to do our plant bank. So we go out and collect seed. It's got big seed. It's hard. You have to bag it and collect it, and it gets eaten by weevils half the time. But we've been doing that and building on that collection for the last 10 years. But we kind of put translocation over at this side where it wasn't part of our conservation project. It was something we were seeing as mitigation. There's going to be a major road development through big part of the population, affecting quite part of it. So that's why it's listed. One of the reasons it's listed as critically endangered is this threat that we know is coming. So we kind of put it out on that side. I also put up because we had some artwork done. And that was a porcelain, which is just amazing that she was able to do that. So we prioritise the kind of work at the site because, you know, we work under the Saving Our Species program on cost benefit, and so we needed to prioritise that work of, you know, weed control, fire management, you know, that site work. But as we start to look at things like climate change, our ongoing risks to having those really small populations and having that genetic distinct areas between ridge lines, but also at a site level, do we need to start thinking more about our conservation translocations and augmentations? And I think we also need to start looking at developing our knowledge base, because we know this big mitigation translocation is coming. The road's just been put on hold for another 4 years, but they've developed the first part of it and put all their big dumping of spill, so it will come at some stage. And when it does come, even though it's been, you know, 10, 15 years, it'll come quickly, and they'll want to do stuff to mitigate because they can't meet their offset programs. And they're going to come to us for advice, so we need to be well placed to be able to provide that advice. And doing some of this work early on, I think, will help us. And then just a couple of little things. So we weren't doing translocations, but we have a couple of instances where we're kind of dabbling in that space at a very small scale. So this is one of our very small sites. This is kind of typical. It's an over 55s that got developed, and they've got a little offset area. And then a little tiny road reserve that blocks, it hangs over the road, it blocks their view. And so they'll come to me and they'll go, oh, the plant's in the way, can we move it? And sometimes we have moved plants that are in the way that come up post-fire or because they're on the edge of things. And trying to move, so it's okay to move at this small stage, but it gets to certain heights or we can't and it's too risky. And I think part of our future will be developing guidelines, very specific, even site specific, of if it's in this zone, we'll move it and this is the care we need to take, because we really are working at that kind of scale where we're often down to a few plants at different sites. And then the other is where we've started to do educational translocations. So one of our other sites is at Terry Hills Primary School. It's a fairly small remnant again, but it's at the back of the school, which often puts it at risk, I found, at school sites, as they need more transportables put in for whatever reason. So we wanted to do a bit of engagement with the school, because the school kids are not allowed into that area because it's got the plant. It's also got funnel webs and ticks. Ticks in that part of the area are leading to quite nasty diseases, and having to give up red meat and all those kind of things. So we wanted to really engage with the school. So we got a mural done, and then we've done, over the last 2 years, 2 plantings where we've planted not only the Grevillea Kalei, but what we call the Friends of Grevillea Kalei. So the first year we just had the whole school from kindy to year 6 out planting so that they could touch and feel and interact with the plant. And then we kind of upscaled it this year where we ran a 4-day incursion. Again, we had the whole school come through from kindy to year 6. Now I know why the teachers are quite tired. So we had the propagating. So we got the kids learning how to propagate from cuttings and seedlings with the Duffy's Forest, which is an endangered ecological community. So we're teaching them about that. Then we got them to pot on. So really getting that hands-on and designing plant guards. That was day 2. And then we did plant guard decorations, a lot of fun. We included glitter, which should be part of everyone's translocation work. And then we had the planting day. So while the kids had grown the Friends of, we'd separately grown the Grevillea Kalei from cuttings from that site. So again, we're expanding and putting a bit more of a living collection, because we're having trouble getting a fire put through that with the Department of Education, who don't want us to have fire on the school grounds. So it's having a bit of a backup for those plants by propagating them and putting them on another part of the school ground. But really engaging with those children and getting them and teaching them those things about getting rid of the pots. So we'd have, in groups where they'd have to tick off. And we also learnt in a translocation that Sean and I did for another species, where one of the field officers sang to the plant. Now all of my translocations include singing and naming the plant. So we've made the minister do that as well. And it's a really engaging way, and often the hardest part but it's getting that hands-on experience and also passing on some of those messages. So one of the threats for this species is mountain bike tracks, and giving that message in a positive way and having them write on their guards about, not stomping on them and things like that. So, and because that's probably taken a long time, I just wanted to throw up a few other things. Collaborate with First Nations where we can, and sometimes that can be really difficult. So we've been able to include them in some of our school plantings as they want to include one of our partners from growing bush furs to growing natives. So that's one way of kind of having that collaboration. And we were able to, with one of our other ones, we had a back to country day, and they were able to plant one of the endangered species as well as part of that. So looking for collaboration. The importance of building those teams. Sean and I, for one of our species, we got soil testing done. Then I found out we had a whole soil team in our department. So being able to build on those resources and having that bigger team. Maintenance, really important. Knowing who's going to do the watering, particularly if you've got staff who are going out on fires. having that backup plan that they know that we'll step in should they need to go away, and checking on that because it doesn't always happen. And going on site as much as possible, pretty easy if you're in the urban area. My sites are often closer than the office. And some of the risks we take with our translocation, if you have a lot of seed and a lot of plants, there's more you can do compared to if you've only got a few. And then I think the biggest thing I've learned is the importance of our ex situ collections. Collect seeds, collect cuttings. I've had populations go extinct from fire where we didn't realise at the time that we should have been collecting this material. So it's really important, and because the Botanic Gardens might have limited capacity, we're really now expanding into having council nurseries and things hold our ex situ collections, so we're going through the licensing process of that, and it's a way of engaging them as well, so they often becoming part of the bigger project, not just their local area, so they're holding multi-collections across national parks and the council remnants as well. And setting up that multiple collections and multiple nursery sites, so not just relying on the Botanic Gardens. And as we've waited for some of the knowledge to come through for the genetics and licensing to hold things, we've done a lot of experimentation on learning how to propagate some of these plants that we haven't done before. So right over there is Seaforth mint. It's already been declared extinct once. We're getting ready to set up a new translocation and ex situ collection. It's got Phytophthora risk, it's susceptible, we've got Phytophthora at the site, it's holding on. They tell me I might come back one day and it'll be all gone. But we've kind of used that interim space to do a bit of experimenting. We killed everything the first time we tried to propagate it, but we think we've got it right now, so using that time. They're my lessons.